afternoon to everybody. My name is Sebastian Tobar. I'm researcher at the Center of International Health Relationships of the Osvaldo Cruz Foundation, Fiocruz. The Center of International Relations, CRIS, cooperates with PAHO and WHO in global health and in South operations. We have been working for a long time now in the area of global health, and in these occasions, these ex-friends have asked me to speak about international players. International players must be seen in the historical framework. We cannot take only those actors that have been historically building the topics involving health. These topics have always been present since the 18th century. In many diplomatic missions, we see health related to the control of threats and epidemics, quarantines, how to limit the possibility of evolution in a country and passing to other countries. And the idea that we see is that diseases and epidemics may affect the interests like international trade and so on. Therefore, when we see the first measures in public health, they are initially related to cities near ports or vessels, or the transit of vessels from one country to the other, or surface trade. In the 20th century, the question of health is not used so much regarding foreign policy, but health appears reduced to the system of the United Nations. If in the 19th century, one of the main players were the representatives or diplomats representing the countries, in the 20th century we see a very strong player, which is the Inter-American system or the United Nations systems. In the 21st century, health has a very important political relevance, is present in foreign affairs. We will see this historical development in depth and how it is one of the leaders, and we have strong players under several imperatives. Health in each historical moment presents a different character, and new players emerge according to the hegemonic aspirations of each country, with the triumph of some players in armed conflicts. The hegemony that appears in the countries also we see them in the agendas of international relations. As I was telling you, after the Second World War, all the topic involving the system of the United Nations appears, and the countries that won the Second World War start to articulate their interests with research in public health and medicine. During this period, some authors call it the militarization of medicine, in which basically one of the things that we may observe is that the control and eradication of some diseases like malaria are a question of safety and security for the United States, needing large military investment and technological progress in scientific research in order to control malaria, for example. You have to also recall that the United Nations systems appears during this period after the war with the Society of Nations, and then we also have the United Nations, the World Bank as multilateral agencies that start to try to reconstruct the countries that had been devastated by the war and affected by the war, of course. And in these United Nations systems, we see the appearance of the interest of countries like the USA in order to consolidate power over the world. Basically, if we analyze all these agendas in the area of health in the period, we see it very clearly, the reconstruction of the cities that, in view of the lack of drinking water, they presented a very propitious ambit for the proliferation of diseases. During this period, you will also recall that after the Second World War, we have two great powers. Is the Cold War period, and also the topic of investment of some countries, developed countries, of the countries that had won the Second World War in order to develop health policies and policies against poverty to avoid proliferation of communism and of the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, as we commented, health appears occasionally in the foreign policy, and we see mainly in the United Nations, when we see the newspapers or the minutes of the health meetings, these tensions of the Cold War are reflected in the dynamics and the position of players regarding this bipolar world. During the 40s and the 50s, in these United Nations systems, especially in the WHO, this international perspective prevails. Basically, the key players are some countries, and the WHO is an additional player. And in the 40s, we see the hegemony and the dominance of the United States in view of the threat of communism, thinking that resolving health problems and poverty will or would avoid the proliferation of the communist ideas. And we see in the system of the United Nations, in the United Nations, that the epidemics have to be controlled, considering that the eradication of malaria and of communicable diseases would promote economic growth, opening the market for new technologies. And there is also in this growth, we see the purpose of the sale of manufacturers' product. In the 60s and 70s, we start to see some changes in the WHO, where the changes were originated mainly in view of the erosion of the American hegemony during the Cold War and the appearance of national African nations. We have a lot of socialist republics and also new movements like the non-aligned movement. In this trend, we also see all, all the bases that gave origin to the South-South cooperation appeared. That means to say, not only the aid from the northern countries to the southern countries, but also creating mechanisms for developing countries to cooperate, in which these ideas, this is have the idea of common partnership for development. In the strategy of first aid in the area of health, you will recall that in 78 we had the conference of first aid incorporating the community of health and the resolution of economic problems as determinants of health. And this we saw in Alma Ata. Since this, health starts to be included in the agenda of other institutions that promotion banks, the World Banks, development banks, UNICEF, and basically we have a period where we see the emergence of other players with the decline of WHO and a significant advance of banks as players in the area of health. Since 1919, with the Berlin Wall fall, we observe that there is more articulation in health with foreign policy and with cooperation, and also in the political discourse at the global level. There is more interdependence among countries, and this process of globalization is intensified and challenges traditional relations and activities of the area of health and the international efforts. Since that moment, the fall of the Berlin Wall, we start to observe an increase of players and a series that start acting and being leaders in the global arena. At the same time, we see that with the increase of players, also an increase of the problems of the appear, and there is some larger complexity, and the resolution of these problems many times questions or evidences the insufficiency of the state as the only player to act dynamically, and also it proposes the need of collective actions that has to be more coordinated. We see new players again, and we see that this phenomenon of globalization implies to join efforts and the emergence of new players. Sartre, in the year 2010, Sartre is an author. He said that during the Cold War there were two dimensions in the international agenda: high politics and low politics. High politics is directly related to strategic security of countries, especially of the large powers, and was conducted by national states. That means to say governmental players. Law politics, on the other side, questions, negotiations in foreign policy, education and health, which sometimes were not directly related to strategic security. Since the 90s, the topics of law politics start to be concerned with foreign policy and also national security especially. So that means to say is the difference between high politics and low politics loses some of its value. And we see now the problems of the concerns and to be incorporated to the agenda of national security and the foreign affairs agenda, of course. With the end of the two powers of the bipolar world, we see an interesting situation in which we go from international health to global health, leaving the space of this occupied by law politics and integrating the agenda of the Security Council of the United Nations and also the G8 as an important topic. And health has a very important view in the debate of globalization and global security. We may not be completely in agreement with this. What is the protagonist is disease and perhaps not health. This emergence of new players and also the role of health in the agenda of foreign affairs, we may see that is reflected in the hegemony or the leadership of the we will recall that at the time of the WHO, Nakashima was the director, and it's the first time that he becomes the director without the assistance of the USA. And we start to visualize during Nakajima, we see a crisis within WHO. Nakajima promoted initiatives related to the legislation on tobacco, and basically within the framework of the emergency of the new players, he proposes the need to have health coalitions. As a general director of the WHO, Nakajima was criticized in view of his management model and also the lack of effective communication, and there were some corruption cases also, and nepotism. Perhaps these problems had to do to lacking the support of the United States. But basically what we see since Nakajima as Director General of the WHO is a trend that we see the increase in the funding of the WHO, not with regular funds in which the countries decide about these funds, but new funds appear for specific purposes that are defined by donors and not by the organization itself. In this regard, these funds come from bilateral agencies that condition the use and do not recognize the leadership of WHO, but on the contrary, they impose the topics and the movements of the organization. These donors and the banks impose their opinion on the use of the money, and during this time we visualize the creations of vertical programs on certain diseases independently of the formal structures of the organization. This is the beginning of strategies that focus on certain diseases that will also get out of the world of the WHO, and we have, for example, the AIDS funds and TB fund. These funds do not have a governance mechanisms. That means to say, countries do not define the priorities or do not have nothing to do with the logic prioritized by the United Nations, but they follow the opinion of directors made up of some country, donor countries, and so on. Basically, during this period in which global health emerged as a mechanism and a process in which we speak about different players that have their role, the WHO tried to recover the leadership as a mediator. In 1999, the WHO Executive Committee created a group to work and suggest how the organization could be more effective leading international work, because global changes take place very quickly, so the organizations had to take up leadership again. And there is a report saying that the WHO wants to recover leadership. An authority at the global level should review the fragmented management of its programs at the in the global area, especially and the idea of increasing the influence of WHO on global matters and on global players. So the WHO tried to recover this leadership, but anyway, at present it coexists with other players, like, for example, foundations and banks. With the end of the bipolar situation, we observe that there is some emergence in the questions of health within the agenda of national security, and especially there are some events, for example, 9/11, that created the concern of infectious diseases within the agenda of health of security, and we see the topic of anthrax. So health is related to this agenda of security, and this has contributed to three factors. We see an expressive increase of health funding at the global level. There are many resources because global health became an area which is appropriate for the development of capital and of the productive complex of health, technological activities. So, health involves much more than attention, but other things. The idea also that with the leadership of health in the global agenda, we see the growth of players and institutions in the area of health and also in other global governance forums. We see today that there are decisions that are made within the WTO that affect health, So we see that there are just a few areas of health that make decisions that impact on health. And with this global agenda, we have the topic of the focus on a few diseases: malaria, AIDS, and TB. You see that AIDS was a very important player, and within the framework of the United Nations, there is a specific organization or agency addressing this disease. That it's not only covered by the WHO, but by a specific organization. And within the framework of the United Nations organizations, this importance of AIDS was so high that created a special meeting on AIDS in which all the representatives from all the countries and also civil society try to launch a strategy at the global level on AIDS. However, we see that there is an important increase prioritizing these diseases and players. In this regard, what we may see since 1990 is a strong process where health is related to global political economy, and we see since 1990 the interconnection with the topic of more intensification of globalization is intensified, it's more communication around the world, and there are more risks of disseminating epidemics, and they are seen as threats to the stability of states and sovereignty of countries. In this regard, what we see is that interventions in health are instrumentalized for geopolitical purposes. And in this period, as I commented, is the proliferation of non-state players that start to act internationally. Because the fundamental players are not enough to resolve the problems, and we see new international NGOs, foundations, partnerships, and the emergence of regional blocs. We have, for example, in the case of foundations, the Bill Gates Foundation. All this is philanthrocapitalism because they are different. All this is philanthrocapitalism because there are different areas in which these new players intervene, propitiating programs to resolve some health problems. And also we have, regarding the partnerships of countries, we see that the countries, for example, the European Union, there is a union of countries and the European market, and we see the European Union as a player in different countries, trying to have influence on international relations. We also have an increase of regional integration blocks in the Americas. And since this process, we also see that there are programs of public health focusing certain diseases that have to do with the partnership of players, Gavio, and different initiatives that are not governmental ones, but they articulate players, private players, and also international companies. The emergence of all these players makes us think about global governance. And this topic of global governance has been addressed by other lecturers in this course. But basically, global governance can be seen as the group of institutions and mechanisms related to processes, complex, formal, informal, including interests in governmental and non-governmental organizations through which collective interests are articulated, as well as legislation and obligations. All these players start to influence on global activities, and today, when we have to analyze the players, mapping them, we may also identify some players that have to do basically with governmental areas, which are the representatives of the states in bilateral and multilateral agreements, and you will see the transition because in the origins, when we had health, these negotiations were conducted by diplomats, but we have ministries of health that start to manage and develop negotiations to try to guarantee or ensure or work in the area of health in the borders, guaranteeing health globally and not only in each country. On the other hand, we were referring to the that after the war there was some emergence of countries that tried to be hegemonic, and new agencies appeared, like, for example, the United Nations Global Health Agenda, the German National Recovery Agenda, also the Japanese agency, the European Union agency, and also Research and Development Institute in France. So we start to see that industrialized countries propose the creation of agencies that make available funds or programs to cooperate with countries. On the other hand, we see the intergovernmental players, and there are certain areas in which these players have been related with the United Nations, for example, and we see the General Assembly of the United Nations and the Security Council start to see health having a leading role. In addition to the WHO at the global level, the PAHO also at the regional level, that also are players and areas in which negotiations are conducted. And if we analyze the agendas of the World Health Assembly, we see invitees, for example, the president of the Bill Gates Foundation, starting to revise all the revision of these organizations and international organizations. On the other hand, the PNUD, which is the UNDP program of the United Nations, it's a very important one because UNDP starts to manage funds for official assistance to development, having a position in the countries in order to implement global agendas. But on the other hand, we also see there is a bureaucracy related to these organizations that many times obey to the mandates of international organizations, but they also promote some missions on certain diseases and so on. UNICEF Also, we have to differentiate within the system of the United States because there are two types of organizations. We have the organizations and we have the funds, which are related to resources used by countries. Also, the UNICEF related to children and also related to population topics. And most of the organizations of the Inter-American system start to have a very strong presence in the area of health, in a strategic manner also. We also had the topic of ONU-SIDA, UNAIDS, as an organization that was working on AIDS, which was created outside the system of the WHO as a specific mechanism. On the other hand, there are other organizations that, like the International Tobacco Organization or UNEP in the environment, starting to incorporate topics of health on how the labor work, in the case of ILO, contribute to health, and other organizations like the World Trade Organizations and so on. All these players are arenas in which the countries participate, but also they are players. They become players that comply with the mandates, promoting policies involving programs or resources made available by donors at the global level. In the area of regional integrations, we see players or important blocs like Mercosur, which is an integration process related, pretending to create a common market of the South and the free circulation of people, productive factors, and goods. And basically, Mercosur incorporate health in view of economic dimensions and the impact of health related to the topic of trade development. Also, we have the integration processes that in which we see initiatives and also having to do with free circulation of all health workers, propitiating more economic integration. We also have players that are very important, like UNASUR, ALBA, which are ideological and political nature organizations, and they were created at the beginning of the century when some presidents arrived to power, like Kirchner, Lula, Evo Morales in Bolivia, these organizations were created in view of the criticism of previous organizations. And they created an integration process in which the state has a very strong role, visible role. Policies of the fight against poverty were inaugurated, several councils were created. We have the Council of Defense and Health, and quickly these councils have promoted a series of policies related to universal health systems, the approach of determinants of health to propitiate the development of human resources, also the topic of epidemiological protection in the region, and so on. Finally, as I said, other important players are the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, promotional institutions. Even if the banks, their logic is they are based on loans, many times these banks have non-reimbursable funds which allow cooperation, proposing new arrangements or priorities in the area of health, and many times with the preparation of agendas. Also, international companies in this globalization framework become leaders, and we see how day after day they become more and more important. And they really have relevance and have to be taken into consideration when we wish to formulate policies in topics related to, for example, food and nutrition. And these transnational companies have commercial strategies that supersede the capacity of the national countries individually. So there are we must give responses in a very consensual manner. Another important actor are the ONGs or foundations, and we may find a series of players like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Kellogg's Foundations. All these players are very important, and they have an important performance related to global health and defining agenda and priorities. So it is important to analyze them. As a working proposal, and with the idea of deepening the knowledge of these players, I would propose to choose a colleague in the country, and also choosing one of the players, trying to develop our work to see in which topics these foundations or player works, how these topics addressed by them may have an impact in health, how decisions are made is also a very important point. In the United Nations systems, for example, decisions have to do with a country that makes a decision, and in the international integration processes, decisions are made by consensus. There are other mechanisms, the Global Fund, the Gavi Alliances, and the Alliance on TB, in which decisions are not made by the countries, but these stakeholders or players that are privileged or interest groups. The other thing that I wanted to mention is to analyze how these players are related, or the relationship with the ministries of health. Talking to some players of international organizations, they were commenting that, for example, UNICEF, UFPA, are important players that are cooperating with the ministries of health of some countries, but the relations are established through specific programs like AIDS, children's AIDS, and so on. It is important for the managers of international offices to analyze these players and see how to make a relationship with them. The idea is to analyze these players, as I said, presenting it to your colleagues, telling them about the characteristics of these players. Thank you very much for your attention.